I'm 65 years old, and if I could sit down with my 55-year-old self, I wouldn't tell him to save more money. I'd tell him to spend some of it. Now that might sound strange coming from a guy who spent his whole life being careful, planning ahead, and preaching responsibility. But hear me out. You know, a few years ago I was talking with a woman who had already retired, and she said something that really caught me off guard. She looked at me and said, very calmly, "If I'm being honest, I wish I had saved less and spent more before I retired." And I remember thinking, that's not something you hear every day. Most people regret not saving enough. But this was the opposite. So I asked her what she meant. And the more she explained, the more I realized she was absolutely right. And to be honest with you, over the years I've heard similar things from a lot of people. They just didn't always say it that directly. So today, I want to talk to you about a few things that are worth taking care of before you retire. Not because you should go out and spend recklessly, that's not what I'm saying, but because there are certain expenses that are simply easier to handle before retirement, both financially and psychologically. First, your health. Now this is one I personally put off for too long. Dental work? It can wait. Knee bothering me? I'll deal with it later. Eye exam? I can still see fine. When you're working, you've got steady income and usually better insurance. It feels like there's plenty of time. But once you retire, insurance changes, coverage isn't always as good, and some things aren't covered at all. Suddenly, what you postponed becomes more complicated and sometimes more expensive. And you know what I've heard over and over again? I'm so glad I got that taken care of before I retired. Dental work, surgeries, procedures, checkups, all those things that sat on the someday list for years. If you can, take care of it before you retire. It's not just about the money, it's about peace of mind. Second, housing. If you're thinking about moving, downsizing, relocating to another state, getting closer to the grandkids, it's usually much easier to do that while you're still working. When you have a W-2 income, banks look at you differently. Getting approved for a mortgage is generally smoother. After you retire, your income structure changes, and qualifying for a loan can become more difficult. I've seen people who wanted to move after retiring and later said, "I wish we'd done that while we were still working." If you're planning a move, it's often better to make it before you close that final chapter at work. Now, let's talk about something people don't always mention: the psychology of retirement. When the paycheck stops, something shifts in your brain. Even if you've done the math, even if you have more than enough saved, there's this quiet voice that says, what if it's not enough? What if the market drops? What if inflation rises? What if I live longer than expected? So your brain goes into protection mode. And here's the interesting part. The people who are the most disciplined, the most responsible, the best savers, they often struggle the most with spending. They've spent decades in a saving mindset. Switching to a spending mindset isn't easy. That's why there are certain things that are simply easier to spend money on while you still have income coming in. Third, major home repairs. The roof, the HVAC system, plumbing, windows, that kitchen remodel you've talked about for 10 years. When you're still earning a paycheck, those big expenses feel manageable. After retirement, a large, unexpected repair can feel overwhelming, even if you can afford it. And let's be honest, once you retire, you're going to spend a lot more time at home. If this is the house you plan to stay in, it makes sense to invest in it before you retire. Not just for the property value, but for your comfort and peace of mind. Fourth, a reliable vehicle. It doesn't have to be flashy, it doesn't have to be brand new, but it should be dependable and ideally paid off. The last thing you want in retirement is stress over car repairs or monthly payments. And I'll say this, if there's ever a time in life to treat yourself within reason, the early years of retirement can be that time, assuming you've planned responsibly. The excitement of a purchase fades, sure, but the comfort and reliability stick around. And fifth, your dreams. That trip you've been talking about for years, the one you keep saying, we'll take it when we retire. Then you retire, and suddenly it feels harder to spend the money. That's why sometimes it makes sense to book it ahead of time. Put it on the calendar. Commit to it. Because if you wait until you feel completely secure, you might be waiting forever. I've seen people say, let's just wait another year so we feel safer. Then another year, and another. And eventually, health changes. Energy changes. Sometimes desire changes. Retirement isn't just about numbers and spreadsheets. It's about living. Yes, you need a plan. Yes, you need discipline. But you also need to actually enjoy the years you worked so hard for. There will always be a reason to say, now's not the time. Markets fluctuate. Headlines scare people. Something always feels uncertain. I'm not telling you to be careless. I'm saying be intentional. Invest in your health. Invest in your home. Invest in comfort. Invest in experiences. Don't just save wisely. Learn to spend wisely too.